Okay, good afternoon for those of you who are on Eastern Time. Thank you for joining us, and good morning and good evening for everyone else outside of that time frame. My name's Elisa Douglas. I'm Director of Alumni Engagement and Programs at Columbia Business School. Welcome to our CBS Faculty Live virtual talk. So this virtual series brings our CBS thought leaders to you no matter where you are in the world. In just a few short moments, we are going to hear from our speaker, Professor Jonathan Nee, on the Platform Delusion. His talk today will draw on his book, The Platform Delusion, and his course on digital investing. He will be discussing with us how traditional strategic analysis and value investing concepts apply equally to quintessentially modern platforms and business models. So during the time that we have with Professor Nee, he's going to present, and then we will open it up for Q&A. At that time, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions for Professor Nee. And now a little bit about Professor Nee. He is the Michael T. Fries Professor of Professional Practice of Media and Technology. He is also co-director for the Media and Technology program. He serves as a senior advisor at Evercore Partners, and before his tenure at Evercore in 2003, he was a managing director and co-head of Morgan Stanley's Media Group. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post, just to name a few. And so now, with great pleasure, I hand it over to Professor Jonathan Nee.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I will take you through some slides. And as people who write books frequently give short talks, this is going to be a little different in that I will highlight the extent and the ways in which this book are related to not just the course I teach at the business school and have been teaching for about a decade, which really was the inspiration for this book, but more broadly, how the ideas in this book and in this class really come out of a much deeper tradition at the business school. And maybe surprisingly to people, its value investing program, which goes back, as you all know, many, many years. So as was indicated before I joined the faculty here, I was a banker. I actually have been teaching here for a little over 20 years, but I became a professor more like a decade ago, and then was downgraded my involvement in the investment banking industry, although I'm still a very modest senior advisor at Evercore. And if anybody on the call is in the banking industry, probably the thing for which I am most well known is my first book, which is about 20 years old now, which is still used in colleges for young people who are thinking about going into investment banking. I wrote a book called The Accidental Investment Banker, about the history of investment banking and what it's become. My focus, however, professionally and academically, has been on the media and the technology industries. And with that, let me see if I've got the technological capability to share with you some slides. Give me a moment. And sadly, the slides are not appearing here. One sec. Oh, maybe here they are. I think we've got it. Let's see. Give me a moment. Right. Okay. Hopefully that is working for people. So the book is called The Platform Delusion. And as I mentioned, it came out of a course I teach called Digital Investing. Now, the course on digital investing is not about how to open an E-Trade account. It's actually about how to apply traditional value investing principles to a sector that often is prone to ignore traditional investing principles. Um, but before I dive into the slightly provocative topic and title of the book, The Platform Delusion, which sounds like an allegation that people are fundamentally misguided about what they're doing, uh, I want to make sure we're all on the same page as to what we mean by the word platform. And that is a word, like many words in common business parlance, that is used often uh, as a shorthand, but also often as a way to misdirect somebody from what's really going on. And the term platform actually means something quite specific. The Nobel Prize winning economist Jean Tirole from France really popularized the term in an article he wrote in, I believe, 2000 or 2001. And what it means is a business whose core value proposition lies not in what it actually produces in terms of a product or a service, but in the connections it makes between players and constituents in a broader ecosystem. So they are in the connection business, in the facilitation of connections, whether it's between buyers or sellers or others. And I'll give a few examples of a platform business. So a operating system, whether it's Microsoft's or Apple's, is a platform business because it creates value by connecting developers on the one hand and users on the other. Amazon is a platform business to the extent that it sits and connects third-party sellers with buyers. Now, importantly, and this is very important as you think about the term platform, Amazon did not start as a platform business. Amazon started as a store. It was an online store, but it was not a platform. It bought books and then sold them to people online. And then it bought lots of other products other than books and sold them to people online. It took possession of them, it owned them, it kept them in their warehouses, and then it sold them. Not that different from what Macy's does, or Nordstrom's or Bloomingdale's. Those are not platforms. The point at which Amazon became a platform was almost a decade after it started, and it created the Amazon marketplace business. And in the marketplace business, it is in the role of connecting third-party marketplaces with buyers. And the brilliance of the Amazon model is that on a single product page, it mixes things that it owns and is selling itself as a principal with its platform business, where it is essentially in the business of running a marketplace. Now, when you look at Amazon's financials, you'll say, oh gosh, that marketplace is a very small part of the business because most of their revenue on the non-AWS side, most of their revenue is from things that it sells. But actually, it's quite misleading because the majority of what it sells on its website are, in fact, third-party product. The reason why the numbers are so much smaller is that when you run a marketplace, you only book the commission because you don't own the product. When you sell your own sneakers that you bought and are selling like a store, the full revenue is recorded. But when you are just a marketplace between some third-party seller and yourself, you only record the commission. Another clear platform business is any kind of social network. The whole value proposition is connecting people on the network. Similarly, most media businesses, including Google, where you're connecting advertisers and publishers and searchers, those are platform businesses. Uh, so let me just talk for a moment about why I called the book The Platform Delusion. It really meant to highlight two somewhat different phenomena. One is a very general phenomena that during booms, whether those of you on the call who remember the first internet boom, when people talked about clicks and various other things that were really unconnected to underlying value and trying to convince people to part with their investing money or otherwise based on a number of metrics that really had very little to do with underlying value. In the boom of recent times, that has been driven some by very real phenomena and other by less real phenomena, you see people using words like platform, like AI, like big data, which can be relevant, but by themselves do not tell you anything about whether there is value. So the phrase the platform delusion is in part a way to highlight this larger issue where various folks who have a financial interest in misleading investors do so. But it also referred to a very particular narrative related to platforms in particular that is, I think, although not usually articulated this clearly, underlies a lot of the assumptions people have about platform business models. And this is the broad arc of that narrative. The notion is that platforms are a revolutionary new business model, that digital platforms are structurally superior to analog platforms, that platforms by their nature have strong what we call network effects, and I'll come back to what a network effect is. And it's not surprising because, as we talked about, the platform business is about connecting people and creating a network. So it's not intuitively crazy that they would have strong network effects. And as we'll talk about, a lot of people assume that if there are network effects, that there's going to be a virtuous flywheel where eventually whoever has those network effects gets bigger and bigger and better and better, and it leads to a winner take all, or at least a winner take most market. What I'm going to suggest, though, is that each of these tenets that form the overarching narrative that underlies this very ubiquitous form of the platform delusion, each of these tenets are false. So when you think about whether platforms as a business model are new, they're not. Think about a real estate broker. Uh, they're in the business of connecting people who want to rent or buy with homeowners. That's a platform business. It's an analog version of that, but it's no less a platform than a modern version of it. Now, actually, a very distinguished alumni of the business school started a business called Compass, which is essentially a real estate brokerage that is technology enabled. And when he took it public, um, in the S1 for the IPO, he used the word platform about 100 or 200 times because when you use words like platform, folks often pay a higher price. But does that tell you anything about the strength of the underlying business? It's still a real estate broker at the end of the day. Now, the idea that a platform in a digital world is inherently better than a platform in an analog world is also untrue. It is certainly true that in a digital world, there are the opportunity to create many more and new and different platform business models because what is the internet but a network of networks? But if you think about it, let's compare an analog mall with a digital mall. An analog mall, just the original mall, I think, was created in Edina, Minnesota. It's a fabulous business model because what do you do if you're a mall operator? You find some land, you do a lot of research to make sure that nearby there are not a lot of other opportunities for people who live in the area to purchase, to make the kinds of purchases you're going to make possible at your mall. Then you go around to a bunch of potential anchor tenants, and you convince them all to sign up around the same time by telling them that the other guy is going to sign up, and if they don't, they're going to be left out. And you sign them all up for long-term contracts that typically will end at different moments so that none of them can gang up against you later. And maybe they'll have escalators in terms of the rental side, the prices, and the contracts that you make them sign make them promise not to open another store anywhere near the mall that you are committing them to. As a result, anybody who lives in the area won't have a lot of options to go to something in the alternative. That's a great business model. You're a platform, you have stickiness both on the seller side by contract, and you have stickiness on the buyer side because their switching cost is to have to drive hours to get to the closest possible place to buy. Now, if you move that model on the internet, you're not going to have any of that persistence. And your ability to keep that value for yourself rather than from the buyers or the sellers is going to be much more limited. You're not going to be able to convince a seller to only sell through your platform, and you're not going to be able to convince a buyer not to click on alternatives that might have a better price or a better offering. That brings us to network effects. What are network effects? Network effects are a kind of scale opportunity where, unlike traditional scale in an analog world, the way you have a benefit from being bigger than everybody else is you have fixed costs that are spread across all of your users. And if you're the biggest, the average fixed cost is going to be lower for you, so you have an advantage. Network effects are different. And they're different in that every new customer you have actually makes the product better. A social network is the perfect example of that. Every new person who joins your social network makes it better for all of the existing network participants because you're only there to meet other people. And the more people who come, the more people are attracted. In the case of a marketplace, it's what they call indirect network effects. More buyers attract more sellers attract more buyers. And again, it's a virtuous circle. The assumption is often that if it's a platform business model, it always has very strong network effects. But actually, that's not true. Think about Zoom, which is a quintessential modern platform business. Now, when those kinds of video apps started, like the one we're on, you used to have to actually download it in order to use it. And if you wanted to use multiple different ones, you'd have to download multiple different apps. So there was a network effect because you only wanted to use the one that other people had already downloaded the most. But now, all of these apps are accessible through a browser. So the size of the network is the size of the network of everybody with a browser. So Zoom versus Microsoft Teams versus the Google product, none of them have an advantage over anybody else because of the size of their network, because the size of the network is identical. It's everybody with a browser. So just because you are a platform business doesn't mean you have strong network effects. And even if you do have network effects, does it really mean that you're going to win automatically? If you look at the quintessential platform businesses like the social networks, look at Facebook. Um, if it were true that they inexorably would simply get 100% market share, why do they spend all that time buying hundreds and hundreds of acquisitions? They're not philanthropists. If they're going to crush these people automatically, they certainly wouldn't be writing them checks. So none of these assumptions about platform businesses inherently being fabulous are true. Now, when this book came out a year or so ago, it got a lot of press. The New York Times Book Review was covered in Harvard Business Review did a whole profile of the book with the focus of the implications on what it meant for the largest tech companies. But really, when you cut through it, the point of both the book and the class is not newfangled. It's not about tech. It's about the importance of the fundamental concepts that underlie value investing. And the fundamental concept that Bruce Greenwald, I think, is the first person who really highlighted in his book Competition Demystified, is that although when people talk about strategic advantage, they always think about Michael Porter and the five forces. What Greenwald and the value investing program at Columbia Business School has always done is say, when you cut through it, five forces are interesting, but it's four forces too many. At the end of the day, what really matters for creating value is whether or not there are barriers to entry. And barriers to entry and competitive advantage are the same thing. Because if other people can copy something, if other people can enter, it's not an advantage. And so the fundamental strategic question you need to ask is, are there barriers to entry? And that is the basic economic driver of whether or not you're going to be able to get supernormal returns for some period of time. A structural competitive advantage means you've got a structural barrier to entry. And what are those barriers to entry? The reality is there aren't that many. And the best franchises, whether analog or digital, are typically built on scale, reinforced by either some kind of customer captivity or some kind of proprietary technology. And it's the interaction between scale and either customer captivity or proprietary technology that time and again you see in the best business franchises. Now, people say, well, everybody always claims to have a competitive advantage. How do you know? Well, if you think about it, it's not that complicated. If the point is there must be a barrier to entry, the best way to look for that is the market share stable? Because if it's stable, that means people aren't entering and exiting. But if the market share jumps up and down, like for instance, In the movie business. I do a lot in pure media. If you look at the market share of any movie studio in any year, it jumps significantly from one year to the next, whether Paramount is big one year or Universal is big the next year. By contrast, the market shares between Coke and Pepsi stay radically close to each other. So that's a good way to test. And then the other obvious test is, do you get supernormal profits? Because that is the way to get supernormal profits. Can you get return on equity above average? When you go into the digital world, words like platform or AI or big data, they're relevant in terms of understanding the business model, but they themselves are not competitive advantages. First mover advantage is frequently highlighted, but when you think about almost any industry, the chances that the person who went first was the winner is exceedingly low. Even in search, even in social networks, even in the key categories of the digital economy, going first is not the advantage. The advantage is getting scale. And in the very few situations where going first allows you to move quickly to get scale, there's an advantage, but the advantage is scale, not going first in itself. And in the digital environment, you see people bringing up uh, different kinds of tests to assess whether or not it's a great business. One that you hear all the time is it a huge market? TAM is total addressable market. And you only want to play in huge markets. But each one of these things actually cuts in multiple ways. So the size of an addressable market, the bigger it is, the lower the market share you typically need to break even. And the lower the break even market share, the more competitors there are. And the more competitors there are, that means the lower the barriers to entry are. So there's a real tension between the size of the addressable market and whether or not you're going to be able to dominate that market with significant barriers to entry. Even growth, which intuitively you'd say, well, the more growth there is, the better a business it is. But what they teach you in value investing is there's only one way to get growth, and that is by investing. You can always get growth by writing a check. You can get it by hiring more salespeople. You can get it by buying a company. The relevant question isn't whether or not you're growing. The relevant question is whether or not that investment you are making in order to get the growth will yield you returns greater than your cost of capital or less than your cost of capital. And if you're making investments that yield you returns that are lower than your cost of capital, actually every dollar of growth will destroy value rather than create value. Now, the broad point of the book is that the laws of economics do not stop when you move into the digital environment, and that the basic sources of competitive advantage do not change. But the industry structures absolutely do change. And a platform business model is definitely different than a straight retail business model. And so what you do see is at a very high level that where there are great businesses in a digital environment, the likely sources of competitive advantage of the mutually reinforcing competitive advantages will often shift over time. So in an analog business, the typical reinforcing advantages from great analog businesses are scale plus customer captivity. So A fabulous example of that in the old world would be cable channels. If you're large and you have 100 million subscribers and you have long-term contracts for your content, and your customers also have contracts that are expensive to break, that's a fabulous franchise. But in the digital environment, the scale advantages are much more likely to be from network effects rather than fixed costs, because in digital environments, fixed costs often go down significantly. So the advantages of scale come from network effects. And increasingly, because you get so much more data, on the one hand, the ability to keep customers captive can be harder because, as they say, your alternative choices are just one click away. But because you have so much data, you're able to continuously improve the product in a way that you can make up for the loss of traditional customer captivity. So from a very high level, what you see is the basic sources of competitive advantage in the overall ecosystem haven't changed, but the likely sources that underlie the strength of the franchises in digital environments are likely to be different than the ones in analog environment. But what I would say is that although that is true at a very high level, and what the course is really about is to say there are no shortcuts. That is, trying to make investment decisions at a very high level is a very dangerous thing to do, because in the specific industry structure and the specific ecosystem that you're involved with respect to every source of competitive advantage, moving into a digital environment gives you some potential upside, but also gives you some potential risks. So, yes, it is true that in a digital environment, the fixed costs are reduced, so that scale advantage can go down. But on the other hand, your variable costs go down as well. And as long as fixed costs are a larger proportion of the overall costs, the advantages from fixed cost, traditional scale advantages, stay strong. Or in the case of customer captivity, yes, it's easier to switch in a digital environment. But as I was suggesting before, because you have so much more information about the customers, you're able to personalize the product and potentially create captivity through another mechanism. And although big data, yes, you get a lot more data in a digital environment, so that seems like it might be good, depending on the use case, depending on whether the incremental data is actually valuable. It can be an advantage or a disadvantage. So what the course is really about, and what the book is about, is looking at specific industry structures and highlighting where it makes the business better, where it makes it worse, and how you need to shift your strategy to reinforce a different advantage than you used to have in an analog world. So how I'd like to finish is to do a little comparison and talk about network effects in the context of two businesses that you would be very familiar with. Uber on the one hand and Airbnb on the other. Both of these are marketplace businesses. Sometimes they're called P2P businesses because you're, on the one hand, you have a business that connects folks who have real estate or homes or apartments with people who want to rent them for a period of time. And in the other, you have a platform that connects drivers with people who want to get places. And what I want to highlight here is that depending on different characteristics of the market and the industry structure, it drives whether or not it's a good business or a bad business. So one key characteristic is how complicated the product or service is. Now, in the case of Uber, how many things do you really care about? You care about how quick the car comes, and you care about how much it costs. That's pretty much it. Maybe you care about the rating of the driver, but not nearly as much. So that is not a very complicated service. So in fact, as long as you get you have enough people on the system to get a car there in 3 to 5 minutes, you're kind of indifferent. And in fact, if you have more and more drivers so that the car gets there in 15 seconds and you're on the 35th floor and you're not going to be able to get down to the curb fast enough, it actually makes it a worse service. In contrast, in Airbnb, if you are going to Paris for your one vacation for the year, you want to see every possible apartment. You care about where it is, whether it's got a view, how to get what floor it's on, and whether or not whether or not there's an elevator. You care about what's nearby. You care about a million things, and every incremental listing that you get there makes it a better product. So that makes it a much more robust scale business because it doesn't top out. The more liquidity you have, the better the product is. The network effects don't sort of tap out after you get to 3 minutes in terms of the driver getting there. Let's go to the last column and think about another aspect of Airbnb versus Uber. Uber is essentially a local business. The vast majority of folks care about the one city that they are traveling in. But if you are traveling to another country and thinking about where you might want to vacation, if you are also thinking about listing your apartment, you're only going to list your apartment on a service that is global because you want to make sure there's demand from everywhere in the world. So the amount of scale you need in order to be a credible service is going to be much, much higher. Whereas with Uber, although they are a global service, they're really multi-local. And so in a country like Brazil, where the fixed costs of starting such a service are super low, they're going to be competing with dozens of people. So the quality of these two businesses, because of the nature of the product and the nature of the industry structure, is hugely different. And that's really the focus of the class and the book. So maybe I will stop here and take questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Professor Nee. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A function. We will not be responding to raised hands, so just go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A function. All right, our first question comes from Tom. He says, what are the key tactics, to cold start a platform?
So here again, it's not meaningfully different than cold starting anything, which is you need to identify a choke point, a pain point for individuals to make a connection. And in general, you want to find ecosystems where it is what they call a many-to-many marketplace. If you are connecting two groups, and on one side, it's only a handful who are responsible for the vast majority of the activity, if you are the platform, you are constantly going to be in a struggle with those few people who will say, hey, wait a second, I'm responsible for a huge part of your activity. you need to share more of the value with me. Frankly, part of why Airbnb and Uber work so well is you've got many drivers on one hand and many users. There's not an easy way to be disintermediated on either side, and you as the platform play a critical role. Same thing with Airbnb. There's tons of people who are travelers and huge numbers of potential places, and you really add value because there's no easy way for them to connect otherwise. So thinking about situations where you have large numbers of constituents on at least two sides who would find value in being connected to each other, and where you can add value not just in making the connection, but also some incremental value on top of it to make it sticky, so you don't have a bunch of competitors who are able to just steal your connections. That's what I would focus on.
All right, our next question is from Jeffrey. Is a moat synonymous with structural barriers to entry?
Yes. So there are lots of different words that people use for competitive advantage. Moat is a perfectly good word. I always ask the question in my class, what's the difference between a barrier to entry and a competitive advantage? And you get 30 different answers. And at the end, the right answer is there's no difference, right? There's no way that you could have a structural advantage if there's no barrier to entry, because it's not an advantage. People would just do it. And moat is just a third word that means exactly the same thing. It refers to a structural impediment to others just copying you.
What's the implication from increasing capabilities by AI? How does AI change the equation?
So it's a great and complicated question that nobody fully has the answer to, because the way to think about AI, and let's focus on the kind of the large language models. There are really three kinds of businesses right now. And again, keep in the back of your mind this issue of barriers to entry. So you have the folks who actually are in the business of developing large language models, and we've heard about billions of being invested there. Then you have businesses where people are developing apps that use the large language models. And then you have businesses that are the infrastructure that allow these models and these apps to work. As of today, the only people making money are the infrastructure people. So if you are in AWS or you are making chips, you're having a good day. But on the large language models themselves, it's an interesting question. As I said before, the best evidence for there being a barrier to entry is people not entering. And it kind of feels like every week somebody else announces they're developing a new large language model. So every single big tech company, many of whom don't compete with each other directly on their core businesses. Google tried to compete with Facebook on a social network and it didn't work out. But every one of them is developing their own large language models. So whether or not that's going to be a good business, I'm a little skeptical. Now, in terms of the apps that use these large language models, I think there could be some really interesting businesses. But to be differentiated, to have a barrier to entry, it's got to be more than just some clever software that's using a large language model that's available to everybody. It probably needs to use some kind of proprietary data that your business alone has, that when combined with the app and combined with a large language model, is able to create something that actually is differentiated and cannot easily be copied. So focus on these fundamental notions of scale, barriers to entry, captivity, and data that's actually differentiated.
You. Carlos asks, how do you foresee changes in valuation methodologies going forward, especially in startups?
So the short answer is their money is money, and cash is cash. And at the end of the day, every business should be valued based on the present value of the predicted cash flow that it generates. Businesses that don't have cash flow and aren't projected to have cash flow should not be worth anything. Now, is there such a thing as a business with a negative gross margin that loses money on every unit that's actually worth something positive? Well, it's generally hard to make it up on volume if you lose money on every unit. But there are an infinitesimally small number of instances where somebody could do that as a way to gain that competitive advantage we talked about, which is scale. And then once they get scale, flip the model and get lock in. So it's possible. But 2 points. One, from a valuation point of view, you need to value it based on some view of what the achievable margin is, how big it is, and how long it takes to get there. Those are the fundamental elements of any valuation. And second, take a deep breath before agreeing to a base case that involves that kind of fundamental flip of the model. You know, people use revenue multiples all the time, and a revenue multiple is just a shortcut. Every revenue multiple implies an assumption about achievable margin, appropriate multiple of cash flow, and growth. And frequently, people use revenue multiples without thinking through what implicitly they're saying about what kind of margin and how big and when this business will get there.
We have another Carlos who has a question, and he asks, how do you think that the appearance of new AI players, specifically OpenAI, will disrupt the existing platforms?
So I think it's a great question. And like what we were talking about before, it's hard to give a generic answer to this. You have to look at each use case to think through that. So take Google. Um, Google is the one I think is most vulnerable to this emergence, and that's because if you look at a Google homepage, it's essentially a bunch of dollar signs flashing. I mean, Google 10 years ago, it was a lot easier to use and a lot more useful. Now, once you do a search, most of the page is a bunch of ads, both in terms of the results and along the sides and everywhere. And with their own product and their product, and anybody else's product is on the next page. So it's a fabulous business model. You search, and there's a bunch of dollar signs, and you click on something, and they ring the cash register. AI is a different way to ask certain questions, and it's not clear how to monetize it in the same way. They're trying to integrate it with their homepage so that when you ask a question, there's a little AI response at the top. But every inch that they take up with that AI response is an inch that's not a money machine for them because it doesn't lend itself to that kind of monetization. And the reality is, for many kinds of questions, a search bar is not the best way to ask it. You're much better off asking a chat GPT or one of the other large language models. So to the extent that the questions that are being asked are not being asked there, that's bad for Google, particularly since their market share in large language models is nothing like their market share in search. And then even on their search business, to the extent that that front page used to be 100% a money page for them. Now, even if only 10% of it is going to something else, that's 10% that they've lost. So again, you have to look at each business model. And in some where they've got a lot of proprietary data, as we talked about before, maybe the large language models and OpenAI will allow them to create new proprietary products that other people can't compete against that will actually make the business better. But others, like in the case of Google that we just talked about, it might make it worse. So you can't, there's no shortcut in terms of trying to decide what the implications are.
Okay, speaking of Google, we have a question from Akash who says that many current large platforms such as Google have generated outsized returns for a long time now. Do you think this sustained dominance is anomalous historically? And what might disrupt their period of exceptional profitability?
So I don't, uh, I think the speed with which these platforms have emerged and established sustainable multiple sources of reinforcing advantage. I think that is different in terms of how long it took many of the comparable franchises of earlier times to get that position. So I do think that is different. But what I don't think is different is the fact that they ain't forever. And I don't think that the ways in which that they will lose some of their edge or some of the or the risks to it are the same. That is, the ability of niche players to hyperserve submarkets that need specialized that value specialized services over time. That niching that you see happen, and that is the source of many old world franchises losing some of their advantage. I think you see that happening in New World as well. People talk about commerce, Amazon wins everything. Well, there's a reason why Etsy exists and was able to define that marketplace. And that despite all of Amazon's efforts, they were not able to be as nearly as effective with respect to that, or first dibs in the high end market. And there are a lot of niches where having a specialized service allows you to actually do a better job than the generalized scale player. And so I think some combination of niching over time and disruptive, fundamentally disruptive technologies, whether that's an open AI or in the case of in the case of Facebook, something like TikTok, which is a completely different social mechanic emerging that captures people's attention. I think some combination of big disruptive approaches that change the consumer value proposition with the ongoing process of niching. I think those are the sources of vulnerability, and every single one of the large, you know, impenetrable franchises have some list of vulnerabilities that keeps every one of those CEOs up at night.
Okay. We have a question here. Could you help briefly contrast YouTube versus Netflix as a platform versus the
Oh,
business
that's
model?
that's fabulous. That is I almost brought that up on that first page where I talked about. So I talked about Amazon and the part of Amazon that's a platform and the part of Amazon that's just a store. Netflix is not a platform. Netflix is a store. Netflix buys, creates itself stuff, content, just like a department store does, and then tries to sell it. He tries to sell it through a subscription, but it is not a platform. YouTube is a platform. YouTube makes its money by connecting creators with viewers. They're in the connection business. Netflix is not in the connection business. Netflix is in the I'm a store business. So it's super important to understand Netflix's advantage is from scale. It is the biggest of all of them, but it's not from network effects because it's not a platform. It's because it's able to pay Shonda Rhimes a couple $100 million to be their showrunner and spread it across 2 times as many subscribers. And that's their advantage, plus customer captivity through their recommendation engine and everything else. So it's a traditional non-platform business. YouTube, however, is the leading platform for connecting creators to viewers. So if you want to make sure that you understand the concept of platform, think about why Netflix isn't one and why YouTube is one. Both of them are leaders, but in fundamentally different business models, and their sources of advantage are fundamentally different on the scale side.
All righty. Well, that was our last question. We are at time. So I just want to give a big thank you to you, Professor Nee. This was so informative and engaging, and I want to read the book now. Thank you to all our attendees for taking the time to tune in and be with us. Please join us again soon virtually for our next CBS Faculty Live program. That's going to take place on December 5 at 6 p.m. We have Professor Adina Sterling presenting on This Is Why I Leave, Race and Voluntary Departure. She's going to present new findings from a study on the reason why workers quit and how this differs across the board by race and gender. So tune in again very soon. Thank you again, Professor Nee. We're so grateful to you for giving us your time and your insights, and we hope to see everyone again soon. Take good care.
Thank you all.